Welcome to the Environment, Climate Change and Land Reform Committee's fourth meeting of 2020. Before we move into the first item on the agenda, can I remind everyone to either switch off their phones or put them on silent as they affect the broadcasting system. Can I ask members, first of all, about a decision on taking business in private? Are members content to consider agenda item 4, which is the consideration of the evidence that we've heard today in relation to the register of persons holding a controlling interest in land in private? Yes. You are, thank you. Okay, agenda item 2, let's move on to taking that evidence, and the second item is to hear from Scottish Government officials who are joining us this morning on the register of persons holding a controlling interest in land, and I'm glad to welcome you all. Joining us this morning we have Robin Cornwall, who's the Senior Policy Officer in the Land Reform Policy and Legislation team, Andrew Ruxton, the Solicitor for Head of Land and Crown Estate Branch, and Dr Simon Cuthbert-Kerr, who's the Head of Land Reform Unit in the Scottish Government. Good morning to you all. So the briefing paper for this session sets out a number of themes and issues that we want to explore with you this morning, and members will recall that the committee considered and reported on the first draft of the regulations late in 2018, and it's to that I'll probably start questioning off. So if I can ask our guests this morning about the consultation process, and obviously we looked at the first draft, we made some recommendations. Could you give us an overview of some of the things that have changed as a result of that consultation?
Yeah, so there's been various technical adjustments to the regulations, quite small minor changes to improve the clarity of the regulations. In terms of more substantive changes, the transitional period is probably the first change. We've proposed the transitional period because we want to ensure that people are aware of what is required and not penalised for failing to take action when insufficient time has been allowed to let them to do that. But we're aware of the need to balance the need for information with what is practical for people. Given the views expressed in the consultation, we've increased the transitional period from 6 months to 12 months. This allows additional time for any technical challenges that may arise, or the person may find it difficult in gathering the information that's required for the register. We also plan an additional significant awareness raising campaign in advance of the commencement. The result of this change is that the regulations will come into force on the 1st of April 2021, but no criminal penalties will come in until the 1st of April 2022. So that's the first change. The second substantive change is in relation to the required details of the associates or the people with the controlling interest. We've introduced a unique reference number for associates. We've done this was on the back of the committee's report, consultation responses, and also consultation with the Information Commissioner on the regulations. In the previous draft, we were collecting the month and year of birth, which would also be made public. The Information Commissioner strongly recommended that we don't make that public if possible and use a unique reference number.
The whole idea of privacy and
Yes.
potentially vulnerable people,
Yes.
and
Yeah.
you know, dealing with that, so you wouldn't have people's people wouldn't be able to be necessarily identified.
Yes.
But you would know who they are if that unique reference
Yes.
number was right.
Yeah,
Okay.
and the way the regulations are now constructed is that we will still collect the full date of birth, but that will not be made public. Registers of Scotland can use that to differentiate. If they get two people called John Smith, they can differentiate between them and allocate different unique reference numbers to them.
Not to interrupt your flow, but I have a couple of members that want to pick up on some of the changes that you've just mentioned. First, Rachel Hamilton.
Thank you, Convener. It was just about the rigorous publicity campaign that you're going to run. Do you have any detail of that you can share with the committee?
We've taken the view that it's slightly too early to actually start developing the detail of that, partly because the regulations aren't actually finalised yet. However, we have worked quite closely with Registers of Scotland to start to sort of scope out the kind of campaign that we might use. Registers of Scotland obviously are quite experienced in promoting new registers and new requirements through a variety of methods. So, for example, they routinely do road shows for faculties and so on. They routinely speak at public events like the Royal Highland Show. So that's the approach that we're planning to take. I think the ongoing engagement we've had with key stakeholders like the Law Society and others who represent large membership organisations like the Property Federation, I think will help us get on the front foot for that, because while we don't necessarily have all the detail of the regulations at the moment, that process has allowed those organisations to let their members know that this is coming forward. So while we don't yet have the detail of the campaign, I think that's the outline of the process that we will take.
Stuart.
It was just a very small point. I know under the Companies Act, Companies House publishes the month and year of people's birth to enable differentiation. Why, therefore, did the Information Commissioner feel that in this case we should take a different approach? Because many of the people concerned here are people who will be directors of companies, or indeed the Companies House documents it contains information about people who ceased to be directors 30 years ago, and it's still there.
I think they just took the view that the aim of this register is to improve transparency in relation to who controls decision making in relation to land, and the date of birth isn't really relevant for somebody to be able to get in contact with that person. I think that was their view.
Might be in my family, but that's just because we have lots of duplicate names. However.
Mr Cornwall, continue with some of the key points. We'll go through them. Members will probably jump in as and when.
Okay.
So the last thing you mentioned was the unique reference number.
Yes. So yeah, the regulations have been amended to include that Registers of Scotland will allocate a unique reference number to an associate, and in that, if an associate was, say, had a controlling interest in 4 different areas of land, they would have the same unique reference number sitting across that.
In terms of the definitions, Stuart, you wanted to pick up on some of the definitions.
Inevitably, Convener, I shall probably go over some old ground that we probably should know, but it's probably useful, at least to me, to revisit some of it and just make sure before we move forward we've got a proper understanding of some of the definitions. The 3 in which I'm taking a particular interest here are significant influence, controlled influence and associate. Now, in the draft instrument that's before us, at the interpretation section 2, under subsection 2, control is a reference to where a person can direct the activities of another. However, I find when I move forward to Schedule 1, which is this part applies to a person, the associate, and then the exceptions, and I go to the exceptions 2B1. One of the exceptions is the creditor of the individual, and then it, in brackets, gives the example, such as the holder of a standard security. And I really just wonder, because the holder of a standard security has considerable influence, potentially, over the landowner to whom that security applies. And I just kind of wondered why people who've got a standard security are not regarded as an associate. Because, you know, the bank, the typical holders of a standard security, can basically pull the plug on the landowner the moment they default on sometimes relatively small items in agreements that are contractual agreements. So I just wondered why standard securities are an example of something that's excluded, and in general, why creditors as a whole, even where there isn't a standard security, are excluded, and how you came to that conclusion.
I mean, I think that the reason why creditors are not considered to be part of this is I think that the overall approach to the regulations is to try and identify where there are opaque ownership arrangements, really, and where the control of the land is not apparent from looking at, for example, the land register. I think that we felt that creditors were similar to professional advisors in the sense that they, while it may be that they have control as a result of their the fact that they're a creditor, it's not really what the register was aimed at, and it's about trying to identify those who can direct what land, the use of land particularly, and it was just felt that they didn't really fall into that category. We can always sort of consider whether they should be or not. But I think that the idea was to try and focus on particular ownership structures in the first instance, and try and identify that transparency and allow people to engage with those who control decision making. And I think that that was the intention of the regulations.
Well, there. I can sort of understand it in one sense, and indeed in standard securities they will almost certainly be visible as part of the register, because the standard security is not worth very much if you don't actually put it in the land register, which therefore leads to the question, in looking at this new register, will it be apparent that there is a standard security, which is in another part of the register, so Scotland's area of responsibility. And I think this opens up a more general question about how people can access data, of which this is but one example, and I guess other colleagues might go there. Is it likely, therefore, that when you're looking at who is an interest in land, that this will lead you to a standard security, where you do have a creditor who has significant influence over what the person who owns the land actually does?
I mean, I think the information will be held, as you pick up, on two different registers. Registers of Scotland do envisage that more information it holds will be accessible via Scotland in a single online portal. So we'll look to bring together a lot of the information that ROS hold on the registers to provide a one-stop shop.
Right. I mean, I've used Scotland in its present incarnation, which is a pale shadow of what it will become, I think it's fair to say. And I can sort of see that. Now, just continuing on interpretation, and still at 2, but now at B, for the purpose, a reference to dealings in land with disposing, creating real rights. Now, is that about the analogue of real burdens, which would be in the register, the land register as it currently exists, or is that referring to something different? Because, of course, a real burden is normally something like a heritable right of access would be an example, as a real burden, but the real right is a heritable right of access. And I'm just wondering what real rights in that context actually means.
Would include real burdens. However, I think it's a more general reference to sort of transactions generally. I think that's what that.
Can you give me an example beyond real burdens then? Because I'm not a lawyer. I might vaguely sound as if I know more about the law than I actually do, because I've got some of the terminology. So what would be another example beyond real burdens?
I think it's referring to somebody who has control over the land, so they have the ability to create a real right, which would be to grant a long lease, for instance, would be a real right. Right. So somebody that has the ability to create real rights or grant a servitude right of access, actually has the ability to grant that right, thereby creating a real burden.
Right. But of course, utilities have the right of access, but are independent of all this because they're not.
I think I'd have to double check this. I think it's more of a statutory right.
Yes, their right is statutory. That's certainly true for a wide range of things, although curiously not for transmission of heat. But just don't go there. I'm straying well off the subject, Camilla, on that. Now, and continuing on to C, significant influence is a reference to where a person is able to ensure another person will typically adopt the product. Now, what does that mean? Because it's clearly a lesser thing than the other definitions. One can sort of see a hierarchy, control, and so on, and significant influence. And again, I sort of come back to where creditors can have significant influence, and yet in Schedule 1 we're specifically excluding it. So if it's not people like creditors, who would be an example of significant influencers in this context?
I think that is really focused on sort of less formal arrangements than the control aspect. So it's where, for example, if you have a partnership, there may be somebody who used to be a partner but no longer is a partner, but still exercises significant influence over the partnership by giving advice and telling people, giving advice in terms of how to use the land, and it would bring those sorts of people in. So I think it's a way to try and ensure that you can't simply step out of a formal ownership structure and still influence the dealings in land, and try and catch that in that way. And it's based on definitions which are in the persons of significant control regime. So that they use that term as well. So that's kind of what that's.
So if the owner of land bumps into a previous partner in the pub on a Sunday, and the previous owner says, "I see you're putting something or other in that field or other. I'm a bit surprised with the soil type we've got there that you're doing that. Have you thought about, is that caught or is that not caught?"
I think you'd have to decide whether that's significant influence or not. But I think that, okay. I mean, we have
you said you have to decide. Right, that maybe goes to the heart of it. Who is it who has to decide?
It's ultimately the recorded person, the person who owns the land or tenants.
But there are duties on the associate if they become aware that they're an associate, and there's a sanction regime if they become aware they're an associate if they don't take action. So this person who was the previous partner who bumped into the continuing partner, single, and offered him some informal advice over a pint in the pub on a Sunday or whatever other day of the week, is he now under the cosh to take action?
I don't think the recorded person would be under an obligation to follow that advice, so they can't actually direct the recorded
so it's
person.
the directing that's the essence of it. Right, okay, that's quite helpful. I suspect, Convener, I may have exhausted what I want to ask just now,
Fine,
but I may come back.
I want to move on to recording of names and addresses and the consistency across. Finlay, you have some questions on that.
Thank you, Convener. It was quite a lengthy discussion at committee stage previously in regards to addresses and whether home addresses or a business address was used on the register, because there were concerns that if there was any pressure groups or whatever, and people who were unhappy with the way a parcel of land was being managed, you could get a knock on the door or intimidated or whatever. There was a safety issue there. What is the final decision on whether business or personal home addresses are going to be used in the register?
I think the important thing is that it's a genuine contact address where the person can be contacted. So it could be a business address, it could be a personal address, as long as it would be up to the individual to supply an address. And if they decided to use a personal address, that would be their own decision. But the important thing is they can actually be contacted by that address.
Okay, and how will that be tested? Will it be tested just when something arises that they need to be contacted and that doesn't happen? There's not going to be any checking of the database. It's just going to be as people use the register and they find that someone hasn't registered correctly.
I think when somebody enters an address, the addresses will come from a database to ensure the sort of accuracy and nobody enters an incorrect postcode by mistake or that kind of thing.
Okay.
Yes.
We also raised concerns about whether the address required to be in Scotland. we still don't have a view on whether that's something that's going to be mandatory or whether it will just, as you've previously said, just an address where the controlling interest can actually be contacted.
So we've taken the view, I think, that the address does not have to be in Scotland. This is partly, I think, because an overseas entity may not have an address in Scotland, things like that. So yeah, we haven't prescribed that an address has to be in Scotland.
Can I ask about, so when someone is actually registering their interest on land, is there any guidance to say that if the address that you're putting in, you must be contactable, which would mean that you have to respond to inquiries within a certain period of time? Is that some guidance that you would give?
I mean, there are various time limits within the regulations in terms of duties to respond and duties to provide information in certain times. So those provide time limits by which people would have to respond.
Yeah, so people can't just be putting in an address and they just think, well, that's me done that. There is actually guidance that this is the address that you must be able to be found, and obviously that's putting a duty on them to actually respond to inquiries within a certain period of time. What's that period of time? I mean, what are you thinking?
There are different different periods in different in terms of different regulations. But for example, in order for the recorded person who's the owner or the tenant of land to inform their associates about the fact that they're about to register, they need to do that within 60 days. So that's the kind of sort of time limits that we're talking about generally across the regulations. It's allowing people to do things within kind of 60 days.
Right, so actually there would be an onus on them to respond to an inquiry from someone within 60 days.
And things need to happen within those time periods.
Right,
yeah.
okay. Claudia.
Thank you, Vina, and good morning to you all. I'm quite concerned by the response that you gave about whether the address would have to be in Scotland in view of the contactability of people who have the responsibilities to register and their traceability. And I wonder if you could expand on why the Scottish Government made that decision, because it actually says under 28, which my colleague Finn raised, that we requested the Scottish Government provide a view, and it says a view has not been provided in the responses. This is the first time that I've actually heard that, and could you expand on that, please?
So just obviously overseas entities are within scope of the regulations.
Yes.
But their associates may not be able to provide an address at which they are contactable in Scotland. Also, some of those who are within scope may be based elsewhere in the UK or abroad, and may not be able to provide a Scottish contact address.
I'm sorry, why would that be if it's said in, and I'm not suggesting, I'm simply giving my view, that it would seem to make sense to me that there should be an address where somebody who owns land in Scotland is contactable in Scotland. And I don't understand why the Scottish Government would move away from that.
I think in practice it may be that they may use a solicitor or something who's based in Scotland, but we've not prescribed that within the regulations because they may use a solicitor that's based in England, for example. So I don't think it's something we want to prescribe within the regulations.
Okay. I thought the whole idea was transparency, and one of the big difficulties with land in Scotland in some areas, parcels of land, is that we don't really know who owns them. And that doesn't help to contact people, I think.
They would still be under an obligation to provide a contact address, I think is the key point. Whether it's in Scotland or not, there would still be a contact address available.
That's the Scottish Government view.
Crucially.
I don't see fines going over borders either. I'm raising that point.
Okay. Stuart, you had a quick question.
It was just a very small point. The point was made that the register would use a database to check in a UK address, I presume. What database? Now, the reason I ask is because I think the one that's mostly used will be the Post Office, Royal Mail's database. I have to say, from personal experience, our address dropped off that register for 3 years accidentally due to administrative error. And of course, we didn't immediately spot that because we were still getting mail. So I just wondered, we're placing a duty on them to do that. but perhaps we're not clear that they have the means to do it validly. And on foreign addresses, I just picked 3 areas where it's very difficult to contact people: South Ossetia, Abkhazia and North Cyprus, because they're all in jurisdictions that are recognised, not recognised internationally, but are clearly physical presences on the ground. I wonder, and there are others, and I wonder how we deal with these.
On the what data will be used for addressing, I'm not entirely sure. I think it's more an implementation question when Registers of Scotland come to build the system, on what data set we would actually use.
But just my general point is, given that there are, and I've hopefully identified some limitations, limitations on their ability to, in practice, verify addresses, I presume, therefore, it's an aspiration rather than a legal requirement that they check addresses, or is it a legal requirement? You know, in other words, do they have to be sure that they have an address that through which somebody is contactable, or is the obligation on the person making the registration to provide an address? And if they fail to do one through which they're contactable, it's their problem, not the registrar's problem.
I think that's the position, is that ultimately the duties are on the recorded person and ultimately the associates to provide information that allows them to comply with their duties, rather than it being a case of the registers verifying individual addresses abroad.
Rachel, you had a question on this.
My colleagues are going to cover criminal offences, but I just wanted to clarify a point that you made just there about 60 days to register. Is that correct?
There are various time limits, but I think I just picked one time limit, which was about responding to notices given.
Okay, I think I'll stop there, because I know that my colleagues are going to cover that in more detail, and I'll listen to what the questions they have. Thank you.
Finlay.
One other thing we discussed again in the committee previously was validation of the information. Now, if we're going to have addresses and we're going to oblige people to respond to correspondence within 60 days, I'm still uncertain as whether there's an intention to have a validation process. So once the register's up and running in 2022, whether there could be a very simple process of writing to all the people on the address, asking them to validate their entry by, it could be something as simple as a rip-off slip that says they acknowledge receipt of the request to validate their address. That would go a great way to ensuring that the data was as accurate as possible. Is that something that was considered?
So you're talking about after individuals' details are already on the register?
Yes.
I don't think anything's been considered for that point. I mean, individuals are under duties to provide accurate information to the keeper, and are liable for criminal offences if they knowingly give false information or fail to give information to the keeper. The register would also be updated on an event-driven basis. So any time an associate changed or details changed, they would be under an obligation to update the details at that point. Also, if the keeper does become aware of an inaccuracy, including from a third party, she can correct the register as well. But no, there's no plans to contact individuals.
Okay. Yeah. And finally, regards to the unique identifier, will the interface, the public interface, allow the public to search using that unique identifier?
Yes, it will. Yeah.
So it could potentially return hundreds of registers that associates manage as a group or whatever.
Yes, it could. If that person is an associate for 12 different areas of land, then yes.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Right. Mark, yes.
Just on the issue of verification, and are there particular forms of documentation that somebody entering details into the register would have to provide that the keeper can then look at and say, that's fine, I've got, electricity bill or legal document or whatever to help out with that verification process?
No, I think the plan is it will purely be an online system where the person will enter details, and there'll be no paper things that accompany the application.
Right. But I mean, is that not slightly different to other forms of registration we have in society, like electoral registration, where the onus is on the individual, but there's still documentation, you know, national insurance numbers or other forms of documentation that can be provided?
I think the fact that it would be a criminal offence to provide false information is ultimately what we're relying on. But I think given the committee's concerns around this, we should continue to speak to Registers of Scotland about what sort of options there are to validate data. I think it's also worth noting that obviously Registers of Scotland deal with a huge amount of this sort of data and have excellent systems in place. So I think our position is that the combination of the criminal offence and Registers of Scotland's experience in this would lead to the position where the vast majority of information given was accurate and true. But I think, you know, we can continue to speak to Registers of Scotland just to try and find a way to offer as much reassurance as possible.
Okay.
Yep. Thank you, Convener. Just on that point, just expanding it slightly, when we had the previous discussions with the keeper in committee, that it was clear that as things stood, there wasn't to be a duty to check accuracy, which I understand because it's a really significant job. However, has there been any discussion about the possibility of having, if not a duty, at least a power for the keeper to check accuracy where there's some concerns? Because although there is the opportunity that, well, there's the risk of fine and all that, it is still, you know, possible that somebody could have reasons for obfuscation, I would say.
Yeah, I think that's probably one for us to take away as well, investigate a bit further.
Right. Okay. Thank you. We'd appreciate that.
Yeah.
Right, I'd like to move on to just talking about one of the issues that we flagged up in our recommendations. We were very keen to put forward the point that there may be people who are vulnerable who might have to register their interest in the land, and that might actually put them at risk. Could you go through what you have done? I know you've got the unique reference, etc., and you've alluded to some of the issues. Could you go over, just give us the detail on what you've done to ensure that at-risk people will not be at further risk by declaring their controlling interest?
So Schedule 3 of the regulations outline the security declaration criteria. So this is when an associate would provide their details, but it wouldn't be made public on the register. We've done a few things around that. We've introduced so Regulation 4.2 of this proposed draft creates what we call a standstill period of 30 days, which is 30 days after the receipt of the information by the keeper. There won't be an entry before 30 days, and this will allow an associate to apply for a security declaration at that point. We've not made any changes to the criteria for Schedule 3. I think that was fairly well received. It's taken from the anonymous voter registration. There's also a discretionary power for the keeper there as well to grant a security declaration where it might not quite fit one of the criterias. We are also going to amend the Lands Tribunal rules by way of a separate SSI. So the Lands Tribunal will consider appeals on the keeper's decision in relation to security declaration. So if the keeper refused a security declaration application, the person could appeal the decision to the Lands Tribunal. We'll amend the rules to allow them to hear those hearings in private rather than public. So that will keep the person's identity private until a final decision is made by the Lands Tribunal. Yeah, so that's really sort of covers the main things.
And the fees associated with those appeals,
yes.
Could you outline what they are?
So there's a standard £150 fee to appeal a decision to the Lands Tribunal. That's in relation to an appeal in relation to the accuracy of the register, and also an appeal in relation to the keeper's decision to not grant a security declaration.
So at every point, people are able to, have their identity protected
Yes.
until this process has gone through.
Yes.
And is there a point where is this an ongoing thing that's reviewed, or is it just a case of it's a forevermore?
I think we would monitor how many people are
Right.
applying for security declarations, how many are being granted, how many are being rejected, that type of thing.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
And there is a duty on if the circumstances in which a security declaration is granted cease to exist, then there's a duty on the person to tell the
Right.
paper that, and that then the security declaration is removed at that point.
Okay, Claudia.
Just very quickly, would it have to go back to primary legislation, or could it be done in secondary legislation if there was thought to be a need for a change in the list of those who fell under the security declaration arrangements?
We could amend the list of documentary evidence in Schedule 3 through secondary legislation.
Right, thank you.
We now move on to questions from my colleagues about criminal offences. Mark?
So I think the current arrangement is that if you willfully put information into the land register that's inaccurate, the fine is up to, or fail to register, the fine is up to 10,000. Under this register, the maximum fine is 5,000. Is there a reason for that beyond the legislative difficulties around having to go back and amend the Land Reform Act? I mean, is there a policy reason for why one is double the other, or is it just where we're at in terms of our ability to update primary legislation at this point?
I think, as a policy position, we consider that the criminal penalty to be a significant deterrent towards non-compliance, and that the size of the fine is appropriate and proportionate to the offence. We wouldn't, as you say, we would have to amend primary legislation if we were mindful to increase that fine.
I should make clear, though, to the committee that Section 39 of the Land Reform Act contains a power to modify enactments, so it wouldn't need primary legislation in order to amend the Land Reform Act. We could do it through secondary legislation as well.
Right.
So it wouldn't need primary legislation in order to amend Section 39.
Okay, so why is one fine 10,000 and the other fine is 5,000 then? Why is there's a different level of proportionality with the two fine levels?
I think fundamentally the approach we've taken is to try to bear in mind the purpose of this register, which is about transparency of who makes decisions about land, whereas the person of significant control regime is much more connected to financial matters. So I think there's a policy difference behind the purposes of those two registers, and so I think the different level of fine is proportionate to the offences being committed in relation to each, and that's very much a policy position we've tried to adhere to.
Right. Okay, so I mean, in terms of the 2016 Act, then, I mean, are there plans to update that? I mean, you're saying that you could effectively change the fine level through secondary legislation anyway, but are there wider reforms coming to the 2016 Act?
At the moment, there's no plan to do that. As Robin has said, we consider the level of the fine to be proportionate to the offences committed. Andrew has outlined the fact that we could do that if the committee or if ministers chose to, or suggested that we do so, or if ministers decided to make that decision. But at the moment, the policy position is such that we think a £5,000 fine is the right level for the offence.
Yeah.
I think it's also worth making the point that it is possible that ongoing failures can be prosecuted multiple times. And also the implications of having a criminal record can go beyond a financial penalty, which should also act as a strong deterrent.
So what would be that process then if somebody was a repeat offender, if they just felt, oh, well, it's worth £5,000 just for my anonymity? They get the £5,000 fine, they're continuing to fail to fill in the register accurately. Yep. What then happens? What would be the timescale for a repeat fine?
I mean, I think ultimately that would be a matter for the Crown Office in terms of the exact timings. But I think that notwithstanding the fact that there's a criminal offence for failing to provide information, the duty to provide accurate information continues on all the time. So the fact that you the fact that a person's been convicted of an offence and been given a fine doesn't remove the duties to provide the information. So that just continues on. And as Robin said, that can be prosecuted again if there's still non-compliance. But I think we would anticipate that that the fact that you're not just being given a fine but have a criminal record acts as a deterrent, and that it is hopefully fairly straightforward to provide the information that's required. It's not particularly complex information that is needed in order to satisfy the duty. So that should encourage people to comply with the duties.
Okay.
Bring in Claudia, issue the question and some of the answers, and I'll come back to you, Mark.
Right, thank you. It would seem that it is a pretty serious offence to fail to give information on a duty like that. And I'm not a lawyer or an expert, but that there must be I think it's very serious. And some people have highlighted to me that it doesn't really seem to be, you use the word proportionate, in view of that seriousness, and as a deterrent to some people who might have significant wealth as well. So I'm wondering, have there been any responses to yourselves that have said that it's quite a low level of fine or not?
In terms of the consultation
Both,
responses?
yes,
Yeah.
yes, both. I'm sorry I haven't made the
yeah.
time to look, but the 10,000 and the 5,000.
It was quite mixed. A number of respondees felt there shouldn't be criminal penalties at all. Some felt it should be increased, and there were some who were sort of in the middle and felt 5,000 was appropriate and proportionate. So, yeah, it was quite balanced responses in relation to the criminal penalty.
And what would have been the reasons, if you could give me, if there were any? I mean, I don't want to, to have to rehearse a list, but in terms of those that felt it was too low, was there a general feeling about why? Was there a view that you could pick out as to why that was too low?
I can't remember. I'd have to go back and look at the consultation and come back to you.
It would be helpful to know. Of course, I could look myself, but just for the records for the committee, for helping us to formulate our view.
I do think, though, that there was a general view. I do think there was a general view, just as you've expressed yourself, that £10,000 is simply more of a deterrent than £5,000.
Yes.
I mean, without sounding flippant about it, because that's not my intention, you could argue that somebody wealthy enough to not particularly bother about a £5,000 fine might also be in the position not to bother about a £10,000 fine. But I do think that, as I've explained, or tried to explain at least, we feel that £5,000 is proportionate, but there is, I think it's just worth emphasising, there is that opportunity for us to change the level of fine should it become apparent that that's the right thing to do.
Thank you.
Mark.
I mean, maybe it should be £50,000 then.
Do we have the ability to do that?
Well, I think that's not for us to decide, I think, at this point, but I think the general position is we have a power to modify the enactments, including the 2016 Act in section 39. So,
but not yet.
Sorry?
But not at this point.
There's no plan to do that at this point, but the option is there.
Okay. Just move on to then inadvertent failure to comply and the grace period. You mentioned earlier on that you'd settled on, I think, 60 days. Sorry, is that a 60-day period to which you have to then submit your registration? Or is that 60 days after you've been warned that you haven't submitted your registration?
There's 60-day time limits in order to respond to notices and within the regulations.
Right. Okay. And has that thinking evolved during the last 6 months that you've been working on the instrument? Is that your initial position, or has that changed at all?
I think that's broadly stayed the same. Partly because, as I said before, I think that the information is hopefully relatively straightforward to provide in terms of it's not massively onerous onerous information in terms, it's contract details essentially. I think also what we have done, as Robin has mentioned earlier, is in terms of grace period, is adjusted the transitional period to give people more chance to put information on the register without attracting the criminal penalties.
Right, okay. And can I ask about completion of the register as a precondition for any financial transactions or administrative transactional changes? I mean, it would seem to be in the spirit of the Act to have as much transparency as possible, particularly at a point where the ownership of the land may change. So what, is there a precondition? I don't think there is at the moment, but is that not something that would be quite logical, or what would be your reasons for not putting that in?
I think we're mindful to not overly impact the land register and the property market by making it, you mean a precondition of land registration? Is that?
Yeah, a precondition that this register of controlling interests is filled in and is accurate before there is any sale or change.
I think it goes back to the aims of the two registers, and this one is about providing transparency in relation to who controls decision making. The land register is a transactional register rather than an event-driven register. It gets updated when something changes, if somebody sells a property or remortgages their property, for instance. So I think if to add this as a precondition, we would potentially slow down the land register, the applications being processed. I think this was also something that consultation respondents were quite supportive of, was not making it a precondition of land registration.
But if you're considering purchasing a piece of land, you may not be aware of all the history surrounding it, about who the particular controlling interests have been up to that point. And surely that's quite important in terms of understanding that history and you know, how the ownership has arrived at, how it is actually at that point. So surely that's beneficial in terms of providing that certainty and security to potential owners of the nature of the land and its history and what the controlling interests have been. I'm failing to understand why you wouldn't want to have that information clear and transparent at a point of sale or change.
I think what we're trying to do by making it an event-driven register rather than a transactional one is to ensure that information is in place and that it doesn't rely on a transaction in order for that information to go on the register, and that you would have to, it's a general duty on everybody to update their information whenever a change occurs, rather than it being reliant on a transaction. I think that would then allow the information to be in place when transactions take place, I think is the thinking there.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Rachel has got a question on this.
Quick question about the minimum land requirement that needs to be registered. Is there something that is a threshold that, on the minimum threshold I'm meaning?
To the size of land.
The size of land ownership?
No.
So it could, because currently if there's a house purchase with land, it's already registered. Mm-hmm. So where does that differ?
So I think in relation to most normal residential properties, if it was owned by an individual and their name was on the land register, there would be no controlling interest in general. It would only be when an associate actually exists, whether it's a formal arrangement like a trust or overseas entity, or whether it's a contractual arrangement, something like what Andrew touched on earlier, where somebody can actually direct how that person makes decisions about land. But in most residential properties, it's probably unlikely that there will be a controlling interest.
Okay, thanks.
Stuart.
It was only some information. When I took the long leases bill through Parliament, one of the 9 parcels of land that were affected by it was a 1 by 1.5 metre piece of land in one of the closes further up the street here, which was necessary to allow people access to 3 properties, and it was separately registered. So I think there is no de minimis whatsoever about that, and it was in something like a 300-year lease, which is converted to ownership.
Oh, who that person was.
But even that, you know, tiny wee bit, which is the full width of the close, but only a few feet, is registered.
Yeah. Right. In terms of access to the register, Angus MacDonald has some questions.
Okay, thanks, Convener. If I could go back to Scotland and the single point of access now. Clearly, the process of accessing information is critical to meeting the policy objectives. So, for clarification, which registers will be accessible via Scotland, and are there any land-based or land-related registers which will be excluded from Scotland? So basically, will Scotland be a single point of access for all land-based registers?
Yes. So currently the Keeper of Registers of Scotland maintains 20 public registers. However, in terms of land ownership, there are only 2 property registers, so the Land Register and the General Register of Saisons. These are the ones that require to be examined in relation to land ownership. So Registers of Scotland do envisage that the Registers of Controlling Interest will be a new layer added to Scotland, so that information will also be added to that register. They want to make the information that they hold as accessible as possible, so they are looking to bring as much as possible into Scotland and make it a one-stop shop, if you like, to find out as much information as possible about land.
Okay, and is there a timeline for transferring that over?
I don't know the timeline. They do have, I think, a roadmap that maps out the sort of future improvements to Scotland. I don't know the timelines for when each specific thing will be brought on.
Okay, that's something we can explore later. How much information will be available via open public access and registered user access, and what cost will be involved in accessing information on the register at both levels?
So the Register of Controlling Interest will be completely free to access. There will be no fee for that at all. In relation to information held on the Land and Saisine registers, a certain amount of information on the Land Register, including a snapshot of the cadastral map, is available for free. And last year there was also a 90% reduction in the fee for the citizen from £30 to £3 to access the full land registration title sheet, which would provide details about servitude rights of access, real burdens, outstanding standard securities, that type of information.
Okay, and what's the take-up been on that?
I don't know.
No.
Okay,
we can check
have to
that.
revert to Registers of Scotland for that.
Okay, thanks.
Scotland, that interface, will you be able to access the persons of significant control as well through that portal as well?
Yes.
And is there a fee associated with that? Or
No.
No.
There won't be any fee for this register.
Right. Okay. Yep. Right. Claudia, you have some questions around managing of the register.
Thank you, Convener. We've covered quite a few of these things, but I'm just going to highlight the 4 areas, and if you want to respond to any of them, any of you, that is good. If we haven't covered them so far, and of course there may be other members who want to ask questions through the convener on that. So the transactional arrangements, and perhaps we haven't covered the user testing and enhanced guidance, and then we've covered to some degree the how you're publicising it and the means of accessing it, and the role of the keeper to ensure accuracy. So we have covered quite a lot of that, but if you wanted particularly perhaps to say something about the user testing and enhanced guidance, but also anything else any of you wanted to comment on that.
Yes, I think in terms of user testing, the way Registers of Scotland build systems is to involve users and get user feedback as early as possible to ensure what they're building is actually fit for purpose and what the user needs. things like they might want to understand how an individual might want to search and interrogate the information. They would want user feedback early on that to ensure that what they produce is fit for purpose. That will be an ongoing process, I think, from when they start to build the register and beyond go live as well.
Were there any other comments on any of the other points? That...
I think just on the guidance, I mean, yeah, we'll work with Registers of Scotland to develop guidance prior to this going live. Probably touches on what Simon said earlier about not wanting to preempt the parliamentary process and respecting that process. Yeah.
Right, thank you.
Right. Rachel, you have some questions on costs. Some
Yeah,
of it's been
well, I
covered
think
already.
a little bit's been covered about the initial
Yeah.
registration, and that's free, so that's been identified. Have you any idea how much the running costs might be and the monitoring and enforcement and all the other things that come along with this Act?
So in terms of IT support, it's estimated between 70,000 and 84,000 per annum. However, it's an early estimate. It could vary as the register develops. There will also be associated staff costs with that for Registers of Scotland to deal with processing information, deciding on security declarations, dealing with just general inquiries from the public about the register, that kind of thing.
So if the initial registration is free, where does the income come from?
For the ongoing support,
Yeah.
it would come from Scottish Government and Registers of Scotland effectively, yeah.
Okay, and is that an annual cost you're talking about there? Yes.
Yes, the 70 to 84,000 is an annual cost for hosting the system.
Right, okay.
Right, I think we have exhausted our questions. I want to thank our colleagues from Scottish Government for coming in this morning. We're going to suspend briefly. The next item on our agenda is to consider the following negative instrument, and that's the water and sewerage services to dwellings, collection of unmetered charges by local authority Scotland Order 2020. Do any members have any comments to make in relation to this instrument? No. Is the committee then agreed that it does not want to make any recommendations in relation to this instrument? Agreed. Thank you. That concludes the committee's business in public today. Its next meeting is on the 18th of February, and the committee will take evidence from the Scottish Government's on the Scottish Government's budget from the Cabinet Secretary for the Environment, Climate Change and Land Reform, and from the Cabinet Secretary for Finance, Economy and Fair Work. We'll also consider the approach to the committee's work on regional marine planning. We'll now move into private session as the gallery is cleared, as the public part of this meeting is now closed.